Good morning, my name is Justin Hargrove. I'm currently serving as your Western Region Fisheries responder. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about managing those pesky pond weeds. I get several calls all throughout the year about managing different types of vegetation that's popping up in ponds, and most often people are looking for a one and done kind of cure, usually through herbicide treatments. I'm here today to tell you, although a magic bullet would be nice, unfortunately we do not have any of those at this time. Managing pond weeds actually comes down to a group of management tactics. We're going to be talking about 4 types of management tactics today, and the first type of tactic I would like to talk about is preventative maintenance, or prevention of ever getting these weeds established in your pond in the first place. So whenever we start managing weeds, we actually need to start thinking about that before we ever build the pond. Some things that we need to take into consideration is, where's our pond going to be getting its runoff water from? Is it going to be getting runoff water from livestock paddocks? Is it going to be getting runoff water from row crop fields? And what is the nutrient load of that runoff going to be? We also need to keep in mind, how deep are our pond edges going to be? Ideally, we would like to keep those edges at least 2 foot deep. And what that's going to do is, it's going to allow us to prevent some of that sunlight from penetrating to the bottom of the pond. What we get into with issues with sunlight penetrating the water column is that when the sunlight reaches the bottom of that pond, some of those pond weeds will start to germinate. They'll be able to photosynthesize and collect energy from the sun, and that's when you'll see a big flush of various pond weeds along the edges, and that's whenever we start getting concerned about how to manage those. So if we can keep those edges deep, that's going to reduce a tremendous amount of management that we have to do from the very get-go. And one of those types of weeds that is really bad to pop up around shallow edges is Filamentous algae. That's probably the one that we get the most calls about, and we'll get to it in just a moment, how to manage it. In addition to preventative maintenance, we also have what is called mechanical maintenance, or physical maintenance, which is going to be to go out there and remove those weeds either by hand or with machinery. Some of our weeds we can do that with, some of it works really well. Most of the time the issue that we get into there is if you leave any part of the root, or if there's any part of the seed that is left, we're still going to have that stuff germinating and coming back year after year. So preventative maintenance, then mechanical maintenance, both of those are tools in our toolbox. We also have biological control, and what that's going to be is to release either grass carp or tilapia into our fishery to consume a lot of those vegetative plants. For some of our weeds it works really well. Some of our other weeds, mostly the emergent ones, your biological controls are not going to be quite as effective. So we'll talk about where and when we can use those, and with which plants. Our other main issue, or another type of control that we can use, is the chemical control, and that's probably, if we're talking about control options being tools in the toolbox, chemical control is going to be your hammer. That's where you're going to be able to knock a lot of these weeds out and get them under control, along with some of our other management options. So one of the weeds that I've already mentioned this morning is our Filamentous algae. And it's that slimy, kind of gross, snotty stuff that grows on the bottom of your pond. Whenever it dies off, it'll float up to the top. Whenever you're out there fishing, or your grandkids are fishing, they'll pull a lure through it and it'll wrap all around it, and it's kind of like snot on your lure. I've got some right here. It is pretty snotty and slimy stuff. All of y'all are quite familiar with it. There's probably not a pond in West Tennessee that hadn't got a little bit of this in there. Our best control option for Filamentous algae is to use some of our copper compounds, either a copper sulfate or a copper chelate. Those provide excellent control at labeled rates. The issue that we can get into with copper is that if applied above label rates, it is toxic to fish, and you can wind up with some fish kills if you're not careful. Anytime that you're treating with a copper compound, you might want to consider treating the pond in sections, divided up into halves, or even better yet, thirds, and treat it in 1/3 sections to take care of that algae. What that's going to do is it's going to reduce the amount of copper in the water that would be toxic to your fish, and it's also going to allow some of that algae to die and decompose without using up all of the dissolved oxygen in your water. With any of our plants that we're controlling, if we kill all of them at once and we've got a large infestation, as those weeds decompose, the microbes that are decomposing them are using up dissolved oxygen. Well, that's going to be in direct competition with your fish, and anytime that we run into a dissolved oxygen issue, that's usually when you're going to see fish coming up to the surface, gasping for air, and floating around the edges. So we want to be really careful about that with any kind of management option for these weeds. Another management option for filamentous algae would be Duckweed. The trade name for that particular chemical is Reward. It does a really good job of controlling it, and it's not quite as big of an issue with toxicity to our fish. In addition to filamentous algae, we also have Pennywort. Pennywort is one of those emergent weeds that can often be confused for water shield or some of our lily pads. The reason is it's got kind of a round leaf to it, and it can be easily mixed up as it's floating around the edges and growing in mats around the pond. But Pennywort is easily enough controlled with herbicide options such as Duckweed or Reward, which we've already mentioned, and flamoxin, which would be Clipper. You'll hear us talk quite a bit about flamoxin, Clipper compounds. They work well on several of our different weeds, and glyphosate or aquatic Roundup also works well on Pennywort. This is one of those you're only going to see it around the edges of the pond, in a pond with particularly shallow edges. So once again, with preventative maintenance, if we keep those pond edges nice and deep, we can kind of mitigate how much of this stuff that we see growing. Our physical control options, we can dig this stuff up. You can remove it by raking it and getting it out of the pond, but unless you get all of those roots, you're still going to see it year after year. And as far as biological control options, this is not one of our weeds that is going to be eaten by grass carp or tilapia, either one. So there's really no known biological control options at this time. Another weed that I just mentioned a moment ago that can sometimes be confused with Pennywort is going to be water shield. Water shield, oftentimes whenever I get calls about it, it's people are calling it lily pads, and the reason is it is part of the lily pad family. It floats around the pond similar to a lily pad, but they're quite a bit smaller. Water shield, it's also called dollar bonnet sometimes, and the reason it's called dollar bonnet is because the leaf itself is about the size of a dollar. They're just about the size of the palm of your hand there. This weed does not have any kind of biological control options. Once again, it's not really going to be readily eaten by grass carp, and mechanical control options are going to be kind of spotty on this one. You can try and remove it, but unless you get all of those roots removed, it is going to come back year after year. As far as chemical control options, our aquatic 2,4-D does a really great job on this particular weed. The issue with this weed is that it has got a really thick, waxy cuticle on the outside of the leaf. So anytime that you spray it, either with 2,4-D or imazapyr, you're going to want to mix in a really good aquatic surfactant to help that stuff stick to the leaf, work through that waxy cuticle, and actually get down into the vascular tissue of the weed to go into the system and kill it. Without using any kind of a surfactant, it's going to be kind of spotty as to how good a control that you can get on it, just based on that waxy cuticle that it has on the outside of the leaf. Another weed that's very, very common in our area that I get a lot of calls about is going to be duckweed and watermeal. These two are very similar. They're not quite the same weed, but they act a lot alike. Both of them are very, very small floating plants that can absolutely cover the surface of a pond. These weeds are oftentimes brought in by waterfowl, and so by preventing waterfowl from making your pond home, you can kind of mitigate the spread of this weed. It grows very rapidly, it reproduces rapidly, and it does really, really well in a high fertility pond. So mitigating those nutrients, taking care of keeping waterfowl off of your pond, that's going to be really handy in keeping this weed out of your pond, because once you've got it, it's difficult to control and it's also quite expensive to control. We do have some biological control options. This is one of those weeds that is readily eaten by grass carp and tilapia. The issue with grass carp is they are expensive to put into your pond. You're going to be looking at putting in about 10 to 15 per acre to get good control. They're not going to control it the first year. And within a few years, once those grass carp get up 20-25 pounds, they're going to get kind of sluggish. They're going to stop eating quite so much, and they're just going to be kind of out there swimming around in your pond like dinosaurs and not necessarily doing their job. The issue with tilapia is that those are a one-year kind of fish. Tilapia are tropical fish, and they do well in our Tennessee summers, but whenever the water cools off in the wintertime, those fish will start to flash. You'll see them out there in the pond belly up, and it will not be long that if you don't get them out of your pond, the herons are going to, and they'll be gone. So they'll provide about a year's worth of control, but you're going to have to put them in the next year as well if that's what you're wanting to do. As far as our herbicide options, flumoxazine or clipper, that's going to be our best herbicide option. The next one that we can use that provides really good control on this is going to be fluridone, and those are your chemicals, Sonar or Avast. Both of those do quite well on this, but you're going to be looking at treating it pretty heavily, and treatments are not cheap. Another weed that we've got with us today that's quite common is spatterdock. It's also known as cow lily. It's this nice big weed that we've got down here on the end. It's oftentimes confused with lily pads because it does look similar to those. If you look at it whenever it's floating in the water, you're going to see this, this part of the leaf up above the water, and you'll notice that it has got that very, very noticeable V shape in the leaf. And that's going to give you quite a bit of an idea of how to identify this versus lily pads or any of your other emergent vegetation. Another thing about this weed, it can be removed with physical control options, but it's very, very difficult to remove it. One thing about it, it's got these very, very large rhizomes in its root system. This one's relatively small. These rhizomes can get up to about the size of my leg, and they can be very, very tough to pull out. And if you don't get all of the rhizome, it's just going to grow back very quickly from that. Another way that you can identify this plant is they do put up these little yellow flowers. We've got a bulb right here that'll be that would have been flowering probably within another 3 weeks. This one is very similar to our dollar bonnet in that it does have a waxy cuticle on the outside of that plant that's going to make any kind of herbicide control somewhat difficult. So whenever we do go to control it with herbicide, we want to make sure to use something with a aquatic surfactant to help it stick to the leaf and be more effective. As far as herbicide control issues on, or herbicide control options on this, we have got 2,4-D that works really well on it. Your aquatic 2,4-D formulations are going to be things like Navigate and Restore. We can also control this plant fairly effectively with triclopirir. Those are going to be Renovate and Navitrol. Or we can get it with fluridone, and both of those would be Sonar and Avast. Those provide nice control options on spatterdock or cow lily. Biological control options are pretty well non-existent for that particular weed, as it is with many of our emergent weeds. They're going to be growing so close to the edge that none of our biological control options are going to be very effective on them. Another weed that we've got here, this is one that I've had a lot of issues with this spring. It can take over a pond. As a matter of fact, we've got a very, very large body of water in one of our counties that we're dealing with acres upon acres of this stuff. Pondweed is one of those that is actually a submerged plant. It grows primarily under the surface, but it will put up a few leaves that you'll see floating on the surface. But most of that plant is down below the surface. If you run a trolling motor or a outboard through it, you're going to know, because it's going to wrap around that prop just like running it through spaghetti noodles, and you're going to be trying to fish that stuff off of yourself for quite a while before you're going anywhere. This weed is particularly vexing. Physical control is not a particularly good option for this because it does produce so much tonnage most of the time, and if you don't get all of the roots out of it, you're going to have it year after year. We can have some effectiveness with biological control. You're going to be wanting to stock grass carp and you're going to want to put 7 to 15 per acre for them to get decent control on this stuff. If you've got bass in your pond, especially if you've got good, healthy, big bass, you're going to want to make sure to get 10 or 12 inch grass carp, which they're going to be more expensive at that size. But if you don't get the larger grass carp, you're essentially going to be feeding your bass some very expensive food. So grass carp provide very good control on it over time. And then our chemical controls are going to be fluoridone, sonar or Avast, Amazamox, which would be clear cast, and then we can also use flamoxazine, which is clipper on this one. So we do have some control options on that pond weed, and they're not cheap, but they do work quite effectively, especially in tandem with biological control, which would be releasing those grass carp. Another one that we've got today, another emergent weed that we have that's just sometimes confused a little bit with some of our lily pads, would be green arrow arum. Oftentimes it's just simply called arrow leaf. This is one that grows up around the edges of our pond, and as you might guess, with a name like arrow leaf, it has an arrow-shaped leaf. They're going to be growing right there in your shallow waters where you need to have those edges about 2 foot deep. Thankfully we can control it physically. Digging it up is pretty doggone effective on this one. Unfortunately we don't have any kind of a biological control with it, but you can either remove it physically or you can go in there and spray it with clipper, glyphosate, or imazapyr, or that trade name would be Habitat, and that'll give you excellent control on green arrow arum. This is one that I think most everybody that's ever been around a pond is quite familiar with, or if you're just driving along a golf course, you'll probably see it most of the time, and that's cattail. Cattail is one that some folks have a love-hate relationship with. It can be pretty around the edges, but if you let it get away from you, it can pretty well book up your edges where you can't even get a boat into your pond. Cattail in the past has been used for all kinds of things, from scouring pots and pans to taking up the roots and eating in hard times. Thankfully we're not in hard times at this point, so ways that we can control this are going to be quite simple. This one is very susceptible to glyphosate. You want to spray it whenever it's flowering, so whenever those flowers come out, they look, you're familiar with cattail, the flowers look about like a large corn dog out there. Go out there, hit it with some aquatic glyphosate, and that'll give you good control on cattail. We can remove it mechanically, but if you don't get all of the root, it's still going to come back. And as you can see with cattail, they have got a fairly extensive root system, and it's not likely that you're going to be able to get all of it out. Once again, with most of our emergent vegetation, this one is not going to be controlled with any kind of biological options. This is one that you're mostly going to be going out there, hitting it with some of that glyphosate, and then carrying on about your day. American water plantain is another one that we see very commonly around our pond edges. Sometimes it can be confused for spatterdock, but it can be removed physically by digging it out. Once again, we want to get all of the roots. There's not really any kind of biological control for this particular weed, but we can control it very effectively with our 2,4-D formulations or with triclopirir. Those both give really good control on this particular weed, and once you get it in the springtime, hit it whenever it's actively growing, you should be able to keep it pretty well covered for the rest of the summer. As far as our closing thoughts go, I just want to try to drive home the point that although herbicide is oftentimes one of our very best control options, it is not the end-all be-all. In order to really get a good handle on this and knock it down where we don't have to deal with it day in and day out every year, we want to try and go at it from a 4-step approach. Primarily, we're going to be looking at prevention, making sure our pond edges are deep, trying to mitigate the nutrients that run off into our pond. We can also look at it from removing them physically. Oftentimes that's not going to completely solve the problem because we will still leave some roots, but where we can see some benefit to physical removal is whenever we use that in tandem with a herbicide. If we remove most of the roots, whatever comes back is going to be drastically reduced and far more susceptible to a herbicide treatment to knock it back where we're not going to have to use quite as much herbicide. And then also, of course, we've got biological control options, which are going to be to turn loose those grass carp, or in some instances we can also use freshwater tilapia to take care of some of these weeds. By using a multi-step approach, we can get a pretty good handle on these and keep our ponds looking much more clean, and be able to enjoy them and fish much more effectively. So thank you very much for your time.